Lydia Castellanos adjusted her sleeve one more time before entering the contractor break room at Fort Harrison. The fabric could only do so much to hide the puckered burn scars that twisted up her left arm like angry vines. She had learned to move with deliberate calm, each step measured and purposeful despite the weight of curious stares that followed her everywhere. The morning coffee ritual was always the worst part of her day. 23 other civilian contractors worked this shift, and most had grown accustomed to her presence over the past 6 months. But newcomers still stopped mid-conversation when she walked by, their eyes drawn to the melted landscape of her face where the left side bore the permanent reminder of flames that had changed everything. Bryce Harding sat at the center table with his usual crowd, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who thought he was being clever. "She's like a walking horror movie poster," he said to his girlfriend Tessa Vance, who giggled behind her manicured hand. Before we dive deeper into Lydia's story, drop a comment and tell us what state you're watching from. Maybe you've met people in your community whose courage was hidden beneath scars of service. Lydia poured her coffee with steady hands, pretending not to hear the whispered speculation about what kind of accident could have done that to someone. Her supervisor had placed her in data analysis specifically because it required minimal interaction with others, a kindness she appreciated even as it stung. The work suited her methodical nature, and she excelled at finding patterns others missed. The harassment had started small 3 weeks ago when Bryce first arrived. A wrinkled nose when she passed his desk. Whispered jokes about the cafeteria needing better lighting. Yesterday, he had openly wondered aloud if her condition was contagious, causing half the break room to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Tessa proved even crueler with her casual observations. "I bet she used to be pretty," she had mused while examining her own reflection in a compact mirror. Such a shame when accidents happen to young women. The words carried that particular venom that only came from someone who had never faced real hardship. Lydia returned to her workstation in the data center, surrounded by monitors displaying logistics reports and supply chain analyses. Her scarred fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling patterns from seemingly random numbers. The work demanded absolute precision, something that had always come naturally to her even before the fire had changed everything else. Roberto Chun, the facility maintenance supervisor, knocked gently on her door frame. "Morning, Lydia. New heating unit is working better in here, right?" His weathered face carried the kind of genuine concern that came from someone who understood that small kindnesses mattered. Bobby had been Army once. She could tell from the way he carried himself and checked corners when entering rooms. "Much better, thank you," she replied, offering him the small smile she reserved for the few people who treated her like a human being rather than a curiosity. The old unit made those clicking sounds all night during the winter months. Bobby nodded and continued his rounds, leaving her to wonder what stories his own careful movements might be hiding. The weekly safety briefing brought all contractors together in the main conference room, and Bryce had chosen this public forum to escalate his campaign of humiliation. He positioned himself directly across from Lydia, stage-whispering commentary designed to reach every ear in the room. "Guess they'll put anyone in these civilian positions now," he said to Tessa, who had started attending meetings she had no business being in just to watch the show. "Standards must be pretty low if they're hiring people who look like they crawled out of a house fire." Sergeant Felix Kowalski shifted uncomfortably in his seat near the back. The young soldier had initially laughed along with Bryce's jokes, but something about the woman's quiet dignity made him increasingly uneasy. She never responded to the taunts, never showed anger or tears. Instead, she sat perfectly straight with her hands folded, absorbing every cruel word with a composure that seemed almost military in its discipline. When the briefing officer mentioned a security protocol update, Lydia raised her hand with a question about encrypted communication standards that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what her data analyst position should require. The specificity of her inquiry caught Felix's attention, as did the way she unconsciously straightened her shoulders when discussing operational security. After the meeting, Bryce cornered her near the exit. "Hey, Scarface," he called out loud enough for everyone to hear. "You sure ask a lot of questions for someone who just pushes numbers around all day. Maybe stick to what you know instead of pretending to understand real military work." Lydia met his gaze with steel-gray eyes that held depths he was too ignorant to recognize. The cruel nicknames spread through the contractor pool like wildfire. Scarface became the casual reference point whenever someone mentioned Lydia, delivered with varying degrees of malice depending on the speaker. Even those who felt uncomfortable with the harassment found themselves using it, swept along by the social current Bryce had created. Tessa had begun bringing friends from off-base to the contractor cafeteria during lunch, turning Lydia's daily meal into a spectacle. "Look, there she is," Tessa would announce as if introducing a zoo exhibit. Can you believe they let her work around normal people? Her companions would steal glances and whisper among themselves, their pity somehow more degrading than outright mockery. But Bobby Chin noticed things others missed. During a minor electrical outage, he had watched Lydia instinctively move to secure classified terminals before the backup generators kicked in, her actions precise and automatic. When a new contractor struggled with the security badge system, she had guided him through protocols that most civilian employees never learned. Her posture during the daily flag ceremony held a respectful attention that spoke of ingrained habit rather than learned behavior. Felix began observing her more carefully, too. The way she unconsciously scanned room entrances, how she kept her back to walls during meetings, the efficient economy of movement that suggested training far beyond civilian experience. When someone dropped a stack of metal trays in the cafeteria, causing a loud crash, she was the only person who didn't startle. Instead, her hand had moved instinctively toward her hip where a sidearm might once have rested. The breaking point arrived on a sweltering Tuesday when Bryce decided that words alone were insufficient for his entertainment. He had convinced 3 other contractors to join him in an elaborate prank involving fake medical pamphlets about contagious skin conditions, which they scattered across Lydia's workspace while she attended a mandatory training session. When she returned to find the crude materials covering her desk, something flickered behind her gray eyes that made Felix step back involuntarily. For just a moment, the mask of quiet endurance slipped, revealing something harder underneath. She gathered the pamphlets without a word, her movements controlled but radiating a tension that filled the entire office space. That evening, a water pipe burst in the contractor dormitories, flooding 3 rooms, including Bryce's. As maintenance crews worked frantically to contain the damage, Lydia appeared with industrial fans and moisture detection equipment that shouldn't have been available to civilian personnel. She directed the emergency response with calm authority, coordinating efforts between base security and facilities management as if she had done this countless times before. Bobby watched her orchestrate the crisis response and felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The way she anticipated problems before they occurred, how she spoke in measured military cadence when giving instructions, the unconscious command presence that made even senior contractors defer to her expertise. This was not a woman who had spent her career analyzing spreadsheets. When the immediate emergency ended, Bryce found his personal belongings carefully preserved and properly documented for insurance purposes, organized with a precision that spoke of someone intimately familiar with military property accountability procedures. Frustrated by the lack of reaction to his escalating torment, Bryce recruited allies from the base's civilian workforce. He spread rumors about Lydia being mentally unstable, dangerous, possibly hiding a criminal past that explained her disfigurement. The whispered speculation grew more elaborate with each retelling, transforming her quiet competence into something sinister and threatening. Tessa took particular pleasure in cornering younger female contractors to share graphic speculation about what kind of violence could have caused such extensive scarring. Maybe she was involved in drugs, she suggested with false concern, or a domestic violence that got out of hand. People like that always end up working dead-end government jobs where nobody asks too many questions. But Felix had begun asking questions of his own. During a routine security drill, he noticed Lydia instinctively move to establish fields of fire and defensive positions, her body language shifting into patterns that spoke of combat training. When the drill sergeant barked orders using military time and grid coordinates, she responded without hesitation while other civilians looked confused. The young soldier approached Bobby after evening chow, his curiosity finally overwhelming his discretion. "There's something about that woman," he said quietly. "The way she handles herself, the things she knows. That's not someone who learned military procedures from a handbook." Bobby nodded slowly, his own observations confirming what they were both beginning to suspect. Meanwhile, Lydia continued her work with methodical precision, analyzing supply chain vulnerabilities and logistics patterns with an expertise that seemed to come from intimate familiarity with operational requirements rather than theoretical training. The harassment reached a vicious crescendo when Bryce organized what he called a Halloween party in the contractor break room, complete with horror movie decorations and a grotesque mask he claimed was modeled after Lydia's face. He wore it while delivering an exaggerated speech about workplace safety and the importance of avoiding dangerous situations that might leave permanent reminders. The room erupted in nervous laughter, but Felix felt sick watching the performance. Several contractors who had previously remained neutral joined in the applause, swept up in the mob mentality that Bryce had carefully cultivated over weeks of systematic cruelty. Tessa filmed the entire spectacle on her phone, planning to share it on social media as entertainment for her off-base friends. Lydia entered the break room during the height of the performance, needing to retrieve her lunch from the refrigerator. The room fell silent as she took in the scene, her gray eyes moving methodically from the mask to the decorations to the faces of people she had worked alongside for months. For a heartbeat, Bobby thought he saw something dangerous flicker across her features, a hardness that spoke of training and experience far removed from civilian life. But she simply walked to the refrigerator, retrieved her meal, and left without a word. Her silence somehow made the cruelty feel more obscene, highlighting the contrast between their childish malice and her adult dignity. Felix couldn't meet her eyes as she passed his table, shame burning in his chest for every time he had laughed along with jokes at her expense. That afternoon, Bay Security received an anonymous tip about potential security vulnerabilities in the contractor facility systems. The security audit arrived without warning 3 days later, conducted by investigators who moved with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to finding hidden problems. They spent particular attention on contractor access protocols and data handling procedures, discovering several vulnerabilities that could have compromised classified information. Bryce found himself subjected to intense questioning about his work practices and security compliance. The investigation revealed that someone had been systematically documenting every security breach, policy violation, and procedural shortcut taken by contractor personnel over the past 6 months. The anonymous reports were comprehensive, professional, and written with the precision of someone intimately familiar with military intelligence protocols. Base Security took the findings very seriously. While Bryce sweated through multiple interviews about his unauthorized access to restricted areas and his failure to properly secure sensitive materials, Lydia continued her work undisturbed. Her security record was spotless, her compliance perfect, her documentation exemplary. The investigators seemed almost deferential when reviewing her files, speaking to her with a respect that puzzled the other contractors. Felix noticed that during the chaos of the investigation, Lydia moved through the facility with the confident ease of someone who understood exactly what was happening and why. She offered quiet guidance to panicked colleagues about proper procedures, her knowledge of security protocols comprehensive and current. When one investigator asked her opinion about potential improvements to data handling systems, she provided detailed recommendations that impressed the entire review team. That evening, word spread that 3 contractor positions would be terminated for security violations. Bryce's termination notice arrived on Friday morning, along with those of 2 accomplices who had participated in the harassment campaign. Security had discovered his unauthorized photographing of classified displays, his sharing of restricted information with unauthorized personnel, and his systematic violation of workplace conduct policies. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Desperate and furious, he confronted Lydia in the parking lot after her shift, convinced she had orchestrated his downfall. "You did this," he snarled, backing her against her car while Tessa watched from nearby. "You think you're so smart, hiding behind your ugly face and pretending to be some kind of victim. I know what you really are." Lydia remained perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, but Felix noticed how she shifted her weight slightly, positioning herself with the unconscious precision of someone trained in close-quarters combat. Her voice remained calm as she replied that she had simply done her job and followed proper procedures, nothing more. But Bryce was beyond reason, his rage amplified by humiliation and the prospect of unemployment. He raised his hand as if to strike her, and in that moment something fundamental shifted in Lydia's posture. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone with military experience, a coiling of tension that spoke of readiness and capability far beyond what any civilian should possess. Before the situation could escalate further, Bobby appeared with 2 security guards, having witnessed the confrontation from the maintenance building. As they escorted Bryce from the premises, he shouted threats about exposing whatever secrets she was hiding, his words echoing across the parking lot. The black sedan arrived at Fort Harrison Monday morning, bearing diplomatic plates and an escort that made even senior officers straighten their uniforms. General Patricia Hawthorne emerged with the bearing of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels, her silver eagles catching the morning sunlight as she strode toward the contractor facility with purposeful intent. Word spread quickly through the base that a 2-star general was conducting an unscheduled inspection of civilian operations, sending administrators into panic mode as they scrambled to prepare briefings and gather personnel records. But those who watched carefully noticed that General Hawthorne showed little interest in standard protocols or facility tours. Instead, she moved directly toward the data analysis center with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Felix and several other soldiers gathered at nearby windows, drawn by the unprecedented sight of such high-ranking brass visiting the contractor building. They watched as the general paused at the entrance, checking her watch and adjusting her uniform with the deliberate motions of someone preparing for something significant rather than routine. Inside the building, Lydia continued working at her computer terminal, her fingers moving across the keyboard with mechanical precision as she processed logistics reports. But Bobby noticed a subtle change in her posture when the announcement came over the facility intercom requesting all personnel to assemble in the main conference room for an impromptu meeting with distinguished visitors from the Pentagon. For the first time in months, something that might have been nervousness flickered across Lydia's scarred features as she saved her files and prepared to join the assembly. The conference room filled with nervous energy as contractors and military personnel assembled under the watchful gaze of General Hawthorne and her aide. Lydia took a seat near the back, her usual preference for maintaining low visibility. But Felix noticed how the general's eyes swept the room and locked onto her position with unmistakable recognition. General Hawthorne began by discussing the importance of security protocols and the value of civilian contractors in supporting military operations. Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to addressing rooms full of colonels and cabinet officials, yet she spoke with particular emphasis when mentioning the contributions of personnel who served with distinction beyond the recognition they deserved. The room grew quieter as the general's tone shifted, becoming more personal and weighted with emotion rarely displayed by officers of her rank. She spoke about classified operations that couldn't be fully acknowledged, about heroes whose sacrifices remained hidden from public view, about the debt of gratitude owed to those who had given everything in service to their country and fellow soldiers. Bobby felt his pulse quicken as the general's gaze returned repeatedly to Lydia, who sat perfectly still with her hands folded, her scarred face a mask of controlled composure. But he could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her breathing that suggested someone bracing for a moment they had both dreaded and anticipated. When General Hawthorne asked Lydia to stand, The entire room turned to stare at the woman they had dismissed as nothing more than a disfigured data analyst. The general's voice filled with unmistakable respect as she began to speak about a mission in Afghanistan that had never appeared in any official reports. Major Lydia Castellanos saved 43 lives on March 15, 2021, General Hawthorne announced, her words cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. When insurgents overran forward Operating Base Phoenix with incendiary devices, she single-handedly coordinated the evacuation of 2 burning barracks while establishing defensive positions against overwhelming odds. The room erupted in shocked whispers as the truth crashed over everyone like a wave. Felix felt his stomach drop as he realized the woman they had mocked and tormented was a decorated combat officer whose scars came from running repeatedly into burning buildings to save her fellow soldiers. Bobby closed his eyes, finally understanding why her movements had seemed so familiar, why her knowledge ran so deep. She sustained third-degree burns over 30% of her body during the final rescue attempt. The general continued, her voice thick with emotion. The fire had compromised the structural integrity of the building, but Major Castellanos refused evacuation until every person under her command was safely extracted. Her actions that day earned her the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, and 3 Purple Hearts. Lydia stood perfectly straight as General Hawthorne approached with a small velvet box containing the combat medical badge she had earned but never been able to publicly receive due to the classified nature of her final mission. The room watched in absolute silence as the general pinned the decoration to her civilian contractor uniform, treating her with the reverence reserved for the military's greatest heroes. If this story of hidden heroism and sacrifice moved you, please drop a comment sharing your favorite moment, or tell us about someone you know who deserved more recognition than they received. True courage often goes unrecognized, but it never goes unremembered.